So I want to introduce Yuqi Gu. Yuqi is an assistant professor in the Department of Statistics at Columbia University. She's also a member of their Data Science Institute. Before joining Columbia in 2021, she spent a year as a postdoc at Duke University, mentored David B. Dunson. In 2020, she received a PhD in statistics from the University of Michigan, advised by Ganjun Zhu. In 2015, she received a BS in mathematics from Tsinghua University. So I'd like to introduce Yuqi. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, but we'll hold anything other than clarifying questions until the end. Thank you all.
Thank you, Clint, for the nice introduction. Let me share my screen, the slides. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to be here. And today I would like to talk about my recent work on locally dependent mixed membership estimation for high-dimensional categorical data. This is joint work with my students, Ling Chen and Chengzhu Huang at Columbia Statistics. I'll minimize this window. Oh,
so hide floating reading controls. Click more where you are.
Yeah.
Go down to hide floating video controls and click OK on the recording. So now you have the full screen.
Thank you.
I know about that. It's really helpful. Yeah.
So here is the overview of the high-dimensional categorical data that I'm interested in this talk. So generally speaking, we can imagine we have a data matrix where each row corresponds to a subject, a respondent, and each column corresponds to a feature. And some examples that I will use later in the presentation and in our data analysis include the following from the social and biomedical sciences. The first is political opinion surveys. So we may have a question from a political survey questionnaire, and each of the questions asks the respondent's opinion about whether they strongly agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree with a statement. And in medical or population genetics, we're interested in data where we collect a lot of people's SNP, and SNP is short for single nucleotide polymorphisms. And we also can arrange the data in such a matrix form where each entry is taking value of 0, 1, or 2, indicating how many differences you are from the major population. And in single cell RNA or ATAC sequencing data, it is actually a new biotechnology that is able to collect non-negative counts of tens of thousands of gene expression for each cell. So we can view this data as count data. They are not traditional categorical, but they are highly non-continuous and non-Gaussian. And one important thing to notice here is that for categorical data, we cannot simply view it as a numeric matrix because different categories could have very different meanings and they are not necessarily ordered. Although this strongly agree example may appear to be ordinal data, but we are generally interested in the nominal cases. So I work a lot on latent variable models since I was a PhD student. And I think this is a very interesting type of methods, but the properties of those and the computational mathematical properties and statistical methods of it are relatively less explored in the mainstream statistics community, but I think there are a lot of opportunities. So latent variable models are popular for such data since they can be used to reduce dimensions and remove noise in the data. And they can help us extract scientifically meaningful constructs. For example, in the previous 3 data examples, the latent constructs of interest might be the political ideologies of people, or human ancestry or mixture of ancestry of people, or the cell development stages or trajectories. So in scientific domains, these things are semantically meaningful, and we want to use a statistical method to reliably estimate and infer them. And also in machine learning, latent variable models can provide representations, latent representations for downstream analysis like prediction or inference. So they are actually very, very popular in like unsupervised pre-training and fine-tuning tasks. So in this framework, today I will focus on mixed membership models that are flexible and interpretable latent variable models that can achieve some of these goals. So the key idea of a mixed membership model is that we will endow each subject I with a mixed membership score vector pi I to represent his or her partial membership in K extreme latent profiles. So here, let's imagine this I is just a person, and this pi I is a K-dimensional vector with non-negative entries, and the sum is equal to 1. So this mixed membership idea actually incorporates both the discrete latent nature and the continuous latent nature. So the discrete latent nature is reflected in that we have indeed K extreme latent classes that are prototypical in the population. And the continuous latent nature is reflected in that we do not restrict each person to be a single member of a discrete latent class, but we allow they have continuous partial membership scores. So here I give a graphical model representation for a mixed membership model for multivariate categorical data that I introduced in the first slide. This is a graphical model for, let's say, n subjects. And pi I is the random vector that is associated with the I subject. And usually it is assumed that if we have J questions in the questionnaire or J SNPs, then we have conditional independence among these J features, given this person's or cell's latent membership scores, pi I. And here I let Rij to be a categorical variable that takes Cj categories. So the mixed membership model for this multivariate categorical data are also called the grade of membership model or GOM model in the literature. Actually, previously it was used to understand disability survey data in this paper, the social science application, and also it was used to understand DNA nucleotide sequence data in this paper, biomedical application. So here, Cj is greater than or equal to 2, and it denotes the number of categories for item J. And note that these integers, Ci through C capital J, they could be different. So let's look at a concrete data example that I will later analyze. And I think it's a quite interesting data. It's called American National Election Studies. The ANES are national surveys of voters in the US conducted before and after every presidential election. Here we consider ANES 2022 pilot survey data about voting and public opinion after the 2022 midterm elections. So we consider a subset of 145 categorical response items and look at 15,000 or so respondents. So actually, you can imagine this is not a very small dimensional problem with this many categorical response items. And this histogram shows the distribution of the number of categories across these 145 items. You can see that 86 items have 5 categories, but there are also items that with only 2 categories or items with 7 categories. So let me introduce the model setup for the grade of membership model with some notations. So we have this graphical model and we have this pi I. In order to describe the conditional distribution of the categorical response Rij given pi I, we need to introduce some conditional probability, theta. So I will talk more about theta later, but here the idea is that since the I subject is really a partial membership of multiple latent classes, so their response probability actually is a weighted sum of these conditional response probabilities corresponding to these extreme latent classes, okay? So here K, small k, ranges from 1 to capital K, denoting is just a weighted sum and a convex combination of those response probabilities. And if we view this more statistically, usually how do people try to estimate these models? For example, the previous two, the social science application and biomedical science application, people used Bayesian methods for estimation. And before estimation, we need to write out the probability mass function of the observed response, Ri. So here Ri denotes the I person's response to the J items in this ANES survey, let's say. Then its marginal distribution after marginalizing out the latent variables actually can be described in a tensor form. So here, let's first look at this T, C1 through C capital J, where Cj is just one possible category out of these capital Cj categories. And this denotes the marginal probability that we observe person J gives this particular response pattern. And under this local independence assumption of the model, we can actually write out this probability as an integral over the probability simplex, because we know that pi I lives in the probability simplex with entries summing up to 1. And here, inside this integral, you can see we have a product of J terms reflecting the fact that we assume conditional independence of J items. So here, latent variables pi I are random, and they are drawn from this distribution, d alpha on the simplex, and they are integrated out. So here I want to draw a connection between the grade membership model and the latent class model, because latent class model is also a popular model for understanding like a social science mixture phenomenon in social science surveys, etc. So it was proposed several decades ago by sociologists to understand the typical patterns in response data. And the GOMs share similarity with the latent class model in that they have the item parameters that describe the conditional response probabilities given those prototypical types. So this theta is what appeared earlier on this slide. So it means if we know that subject I solely belongs to the case latent profile, then what is his or her response probability for the for giving a response C to item J? Okay, so this thing is also used in latent class model and called item parameters. But the difference between the grade membership model and latent class model is the additional flexibility going from the population level mixture to the individual level mixture. So latent class model is a population level mixture because it assigns each subject to a single membership ZI in K classes. So the mixture only happens in the population level, but not for any individual. The grade membership model, on the other hand, assumes each individual is a mixture, and each subject partially belongs to multiple extreme latent profiles. So that's why the conditional response probability takes this weighted sum. Here is a bit review of the previous approaches for estimating grade membership model and understanding their identifiability. Actually, the predominant way of understanding grade membership model is a random effect perspective. That is to assume the latent membership scores pi I are random variables following certain distribution. And the most popular distribution is the Dirichlet distribution because it's the natural thing for modeling random variables that live in the probability simplex. Actually, in these previous two papers that I mentioned earlier, the disability survey and the nucleotide sequence, this perspective was taken. And in my earlier work with collaborators, we also took this random effect perspective. And this necessarily requires us to look at this marginal distribution, marginal likelihood function that involves the complicated high-dimensional integrals, as mentioned earlier, because we treat this as random variable and we integrate them out. So these papers and some other papers that I didn't have enough space to include here, they basically all use MCMC inference and design Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms to draw samples from this posterior distribution and then try to understand the parameters and the membership scores. There are several drawbacks of this probability mass function-based approach or random effect-based approach, especially in the motivating case when J is large. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, in the modern data sets, we are really interested in a large number of categorical responses. Even in the social science case, for the ANES example, the J is 145, it's not 20 or 30. So we face the challenge of high dimensionality here. So the first immediate challenge is computation is not efficient, especially for this MCMC inference. And if, for example, we assume the pi I follows a Dirichlet distribution, and we assume that the Dirichlet parameters alpha are unknown, actually, we cannot even easily design a Gibbs sampler. We need to use Metropolis-Hastings MCMC for inference, and computationally, it's really challenging to scale to large J. And the second issue or drawback of this approach is the population identifiability based on investigating when this probability mass function uniquely determines the model parameters. Actually, that does not apply to latent variables. So in my previous work with collaborators, we considered the population identifiability based on the PMF tensor. That is to say, we are interested in this traditional statistical notion of identifiability of if we know this marginal distribution and a sample size goes to infinity, can we uniquely determine the parameters theta and alpha? So that is, of course, quite useful in traditional settings. But imagine that we are also interested in pi I, these random latent variables. Then this notion actually does not tell us whether pi I is identifiable or can they be consistently estimated from data. And some more profound issue actually regards the sparsity of this probability mass function tensor. Because recall that previously we said these probability mass function entries can be described in a tensor because each of these Ci, Cj ranges from the capital Cj. And imagine that capital Cj is 2. That means all the questions in the questionnaire are binary response. You're yes or no for each question. Even in that seemingly simple cases, if you have 145 items, then how the number of entries in this tensor will be 2 to the power of 145. And that is huge. So the problem here is that if we look at that empirical probability mass function tensor as an approximation to this population probability mass function tensor, that is, we just count in our data how many subjects they give a particular response. Then number of response patterns is a huge number. We cannot expect our empirical tensor collecting these proportions of responses actually is close enough to that population tensor. So usually this is prohibitively large and extremely sparse. For example, in our motivating ANES data example, recall that we have a histogram and the number of the distribution of the categories is shown in that histogram. In that case, the product of Cj or the number of entries in this PMF tensor is actually 10 to the power of 91. We cannot hope that with a reasonable sample size, like 1,000, 2,000 respondents, we can actually estimate them accurately. So the estimation errors in this approach are unknown in high dimensions when J is maybe of the order of n due to complicated integrals. So now I also want to talk about another challenge in this mixed membership model, or more generally in latent variable models for modeling multivariate data. So a frequent challenge or phenomenon is that we have local dependence between items, and this appears widely in applications. That is to say, in this previous graphical model, I didn't have these blue edges, and that means conditional independence of the J variables given the latent. But in practice, there may be a lot of residual dependence between these items that are not captured by the latent variable. Even if you're conditioning on it, there are some still dependencies. And in the ANES example, actually, maybe, so first, mixed membership model is a good modeling tool for ANES example because it may be reasonable to assume that in the population, there are 3, in the previous studies, empirical studies, people believe that there are 3 prototypical latent profiles like conservative, liberal, and indifferent. And then each person is a mixed membership across these 3. So, but in this case, you cannot expect that given a person's partial membership scores, we can fully explain the dependence of their responses to all these questions, because there could be blocks of multiple items about a single issue. For example, in the ANES, if we look at the codebook, we'll see that there are actually blocks of multiple items about economics, blocks of multiple items about your view about racial stereotypes, and etc. So actually, adjacent items are quite dependent on each other and cannot be fully explained by the latent part. So that's the 2 challenges. And in this talk, we aim to propose a method and provide some theory to address these challenges. Here is a real example in the real data case that shows the local dependence in the American National Election Survey. So without talking too much about how we get this noise matrix, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that here we extract like 50 items from this 145 items pool. And we, after applying our method, we can estimate a noise matrix. And then we can visualize the covariance matrix of this noise matrix, totally data-driven. And then if you look at this covariance matrix, you realize, you can notice that there's really some block dependence across the diagonal. And later, we will see that these are consequences of these block of items. They are corresponding to economic policies. Okay, so local dependence can also be commonly seen in other applications like the biomedical field. So here I give an example of a human genetics SNPs. So in this kind of data set, we have many people and we collect SNPs across many of the loci in the chromosome. And it's actually well-known biological knowledge that adjacent SNPs, they will be correlated and cannot be merely explained by your ancestry. Okay, so here the mixed membership is in that we want to understand each person is a partial member of several ancestry. So it is an admixture. So each person might not be a purely Asian, a purely white, maybe is an admixture. And here we visualize the noise matrix. We observe a similar phenomenon that for adjacent SNPs, actually the noise matrix exhibit quite a bit of local dependence. Okay, after knowing these challenges, let me quickly review the estimation existing methods for mixed membership models and then introduce our method. So for graded membership model and their variants, as I said, Bayesian Markov chain Monte Carlo inference methods are the most popular approaches. And there are also some likelihood-based and variational inference methods that are developed more recently. But here, today I will take a very different approach that does not use the likelihood information and does not perform Bayesian posterior inference. And I will use a spectral method that utilizes the singular vectors or singular values of a decomposition. So actually for other mixed membership models that some of you may be familiar with or heard about, for example, the mixed membership models for network data or mixed membership models for topic model, then there are some efficient spectral methods that have been developed by quite theoretical authors. And also they were supported by very nice theoretical guarantees in that we can really estimate the mixed membership structures based on the network and based on the count of words in documents. Okay, so the problem here is that, roughly speaking, the reason why in these models people can readily design spectral methods is because we have a data matrix that is approximately low rank. And if we have approximately low rank data matrix, then actually the idea of eigen decomposition or singular value decomposition would be really powerful because it extracts the top singular vectors or eigenvectors and it will capture a lot of structure. The problem here is that in a graded membership model for multivariate categorical data, we don't really have a readily available data matrix that is approximately low rank. Here I like to go back to the very first slide here. So although we write the data as a matrix, but actually we cannot say this matrix is approximately low rank because generally we have nominal responses for each entry. And we should not really view this as a matrix with numeric values because here the different type of responses could be just totally unrelated categories that you cannot assign a number to it. So it's not approximately low rank. So that actually indicates we need to look beyond matrix and go to tensor. But it is a very different tensor than the probability mass function tensor that I introduced earlier. So I call it a data tensor. Let's use this small example to motivate this. So in the ANES survey, actually there are the following 4 questions. these 4 questions ask about people's opinion towards healthcare, climate, taxes, and gun policy. So it is asked in this way. Tell us which political party, the Democrats or the Republicans, would do a better job handling each of the following issues, or is there no difference? So now you can see these 4 questions, they have 5 categories. And they have 3 categories: Republicans better, Democrats better, and no difference. And the RIJC, we define it as a binary indicator of whether subject I responds to variable J with category C, right? So given all the respondents and given all the questions, we can define these binary indicators. And if we, for example, we consider 5 people, then we can organize this RIJC in a tensor. So here, this dimension is organized for the subjects. This second dimension is organized for the variables: healthcare, climate, taxes, and gun policy. And the third dimension is about the categories of responses. And this tensor takes the shape of a 5 by 4 by 3. Sorry. So, but what about the case, the real case in Anna's example? Recall that we have that histogram of distribution of the number of categories across the 145 items. Actually, they vary quite a bit. So there are actually questions. For example, questions have 5 categories asking about what do you think of the importance of illegal immigration? So there are 5 response types, 5 response categories, ranging from extremely important to not at all important. And there are questions that have 2 categories. For example, have you posted a message or comment online about a political issue or campaign? So people answer yes or no. So here we don't have a tensor, but we call it a quasi-tensor for the data. So still, we introduce these binary indicators, RIJC. It records the binary indicators of whether respondent I responds to item J with category C. But here, the CJ across items are different. So how to deal with, how to exploit the useful structure hidden in this quasi-tensor for estimation? So let's still first consider the special case where all the items have the same number of categories. Then we have a real tensor. It's a 3-way tensor, subject mode, variable mode, and category mode. And we propose to unfold this tensor or flatten this tensor in that we look at this first slice. It's like cutting a cake into different slices. We cut a first slice. This slice is about the variable about healthcare. The second slice is the variable about like gun policy, etc. There are 4 variables. And we concatenate these 4 slices together, and we get a fat data matrix with a number of rows still corresponding to equal to the number of subjects, but the number of columns, now you can see it is the sum of number of categories for these items. Here I shuffle the color a little bit, but that's not important. We just stitch them together. And the key observation that I will make clear later is that this matrix, after flattening the data tensor, not the probability mass function tensor, actually can be written as a low rank signal matrix plus a locally dependent noise matrix. So let's first understand the locally dependent noise part. The local dependence arises from, we have a constraint, a natural constraint that if you sum the RIJC across the C dimension, you get 1, right? So of course, these random variables in this tensor, they are locally dependent because if a person answers for healthcare, they think Democrats are better. They cannot think Republicans are better, right? So these random variables are definitely locally dependent, with the local here defined as the categories within a single item. Okay, and for the general case, actually we do a similar thing. So we still cut the cake in different slices, but now the different slices have different dimensions because this first slice corresponding to the illegal immigration attitude is 5 categories. And there are 3 category things, and there are 2 category things about whether you have posted on social media. So we still stitch them together and get a matrix. And the interesting thing that we observe is that this matrix can also be written as a low rank signal part plus a locally dependent noise matrix. Here, local dependence is defined as, so for these 5 entries, that for these 5 columns that corresponds to your attitude towards illegal immigration, there are of course local dependence. And here for these 3, there's dependence, dependence, and dependence. And note that even if you delete a column, for example, first thing that comes to mind is that for this binary variable, if I drop the no column, then actually I don't lose any information, because if you have a 1 here, you must have a 0 here. You have a 0 here, you must have a 1 here, right? So if you drop for a binary response variable, you drop a column, you don't lose anything. And for a general categorical one, of course, you can also drop 1 category, because this category, you will know its value when you observe the first 4 columns. But the problem is, in this case, even if you drop this lightest blue block, you still have local dependence among the first 4 categories, right? Because they're still mutually exclusive. So here, the local dependence is intrinsic as long as you have polytomous items. That means items with more than 2 categories, and it is common in the A and ES dataset. So now let me be more precise and introduce more notation. But the key idea is actually already conveyed in the previous slides. So we will flatten the previous POSI tensor into a matrix. This matrix has n rows corresponding to n subjects, and the number of columns is not exponential in J, as in the probability mass function tensor case. It's actually linear. It is the sum of the categories across all items. So it's a fat matrix with the number of columns that is quite large compared to previously. And our observation is that actually we can evaluate the expectation of this flattened matrix, R flattened or RF. And it turns out that its expectation, so here I probably, I should have made this more explicit, that this so-called low rank part is corresponding to the expectation, entry-wise expectation of the flattened matrix. And here the E is defined as a noise matrix because it is the difference between the flattened data matrix and the expectation of it. Okay, so then we propose to study expectation identifiability. Actually, it is quite simple. In terms of identifiability techniques, it is simpler to study than the previous population identifiability, because here we are really looking at matrices instead of tensors. So let's collect all this pi I in the this pi matrix. So it is an n by k matrix collecting all the subjects' membership scores in the k extreme latent profiles. And let's use this theta f to collect all these conditional response probabilities. So you can see that here, the number of columns of this matrix is corresponding to the number of all these categories, okay? So we collect all these item parameters here. And we say that a GOM model with parameter sets, theta pi, to be expectation identifiable if for any valid parameter sets that are alternative. Sorry about the typo here. The tilde we should have tilde here and here. They are the same thing. So this is to say that if we have the true parameters and some alternative parameters that are potentially different from the truth, and we know that their expectation of these two flattened data matrix are the same, then actually the underlying parameters must be identical up to a permutation of the k extreme profiles. So that is an inevitable ambiguity, but the key thing is that they are the same up to this permutation. So actually this is called expectation identifiability, and it really is a problem of matrix factorization uniqueness. And similar notions of expectation identifiability have been considered in topic models and network models, but of course without the flattening consideration. So I will, for this identifiability, the most important condition is that we require some pure subjects for each extreme latent profile. Okay, so we call the pure subject condition as pi satisfies that for each extreme latent profile K, there exists at least one pure subject that solely belongs to this class, but not any others. So in other words, this pi matrix is an n by k matrix, and it has to contain an identity k by k submatrix. It's kind of a mild condition, and it's practically interpretable, because this is saying that we need to have some pure subjects that help us define the prototypical latent profiles in the population. If we do not assume there exist such pure subjects, actually the interpretation of this substantive meaning of these extreme latent classes could be unclear. So we think this is a mild condition. And basically this condition is almost sufficient and necessary for expectation identifiability. So we only require that if the columns of this flattened theta matrix are affinely independent, which is a weaker condition than linearly independent, then the GOM is identifiable. So that is to say, if our pi satisfies the pure subject condition and the columns of theta are linearly independent, then we are good. So with this understanding, we propose an SVD, a singular value decomposition method for estimation. It is based on the following lemma that reveals the interesting simplex geometry in the singular vectors. So let's first consider the oracle case. The oracle case means that we actually just observe the expectation of the flattened data matrix. That is, of course, kind of unrealistic, but it's a good starting point. So if we observe this, then we can do a top K SVD for this matrix, because we know this matrix is a product of a K column matrix and something else. So of course, the rank is at most K. So this is a top K compact SVD. And U star collects the top K, collects the left singular vectors, and it's just a K dimension. So it turns out SVD and the pure subject condition gives us this structure, geometry about the singular subspace. So it means that if we consider each row of this U matrix as an embedding of the subject, because U is n by K, so we can view each row of it as an embedding of subject I in the K-dimensional latent space. And let's use this S to denote an index vector of one set of pure subjects. So this means S1 is the index of subject who solely belongs to latent profile 1, etc. So it turns out that this U can be written as our pi matrix multiplied by US. And this notation means the submatrix corresponding to those subjects in this index set. So maybe this figure is easier to understand. It means that actually those pure subjects will actually define the vertices of a simplex in this K-dimensional space. So all these data points, all these subjects actually live in a simplex, and the vertices are defined by those pure subjects. And any other subject can be written as a linear convex combination of those vertices, where the convex weights are given by the pi I. So this is exactly this thing. And with this thing, actually estimation is straightforward, because if we can, U is something that we directly get after doing an SVD. And S, suppose we can get S, then to estimate pi, it is straightforward matrix multiplication. It's just U times the inverse of US. And the theta F can also have a explicit formula depending on the singular vectors and singular values. So here V are the right singular vectors, sigma are the diagonal matrix for the singular values. So of course, we need to know S, but geometrically, probably you can already imagine if we have this singular subspace, S1, S2, S3 are not hard to get, because by visual inspection, we already can see that it should tell us this vertex structure should be defining the simplex. So as long as we observe this simplex, we should be able to identify it. So algorithmically, here I omitted the details, but I want to talk about the algorithm, like in intuitive sense. In terms of the algorithm, our goal is, suppose we have oracle case, so we don't have any noise. So we observe this U sigma V exactly. And then what we do is that we will hunt for these vertices. So this is an idea that is used by some network community and network mixed membership models. That is, we will look for which vector, which point in this space has the largest norm or a largest distance from the origin. And from here, from visual inspection, we can see that it should be this vector. This is an intuitive saying, but it can be shown that if we have this geometry, then we look for the vector with the largest norm, we will find one of the vertices. After that, we will project all these blue points to the space that is orthogonal to this direction. Then you can see all the vectors that are previously close to it will have very small norm in the projected space. In that projected space, we look for the largest norm, a vector with the largest norm. Then probably you will get this vector. You will get this index. And then you do this successively for k times. You'll be able to identify S1 through Sk. And with S1 and Sk, our estimation then is straightforward. We just follow this formula. Now, let's turn to the real case that we have noise. We don't have this oracle. But the idea is actually simple. We will just perform a top K SVD of the flattened data matrix RF. So this flattened data matrix now is no longer low rank, but we will still look at its top K singular vectors. And from the simulation, you can see that actually the singular vectors form a noisy simplex cloud around the population truth, which is the red triangle. Then we use some pruning in order to estimate all this pi and theta. So we have the hat version of it. So that's the basic idea. Now I want to talk about statistical guarantees, and especially in high dimensions, which is a motivating scenario for this study. So our question is, expectation identifiability seems to be quite a simple thing. It's just a matrix factorization. So how accurate is this SVD-based spectral method for noisy data? Because for expectation identifiability and for SVD, we actually are kind of performing a moment estimation. We just look at the first order moment, right? It's the expectation of the data. We didn't look at any dependence or joint distribution. So how accurate is this method? And how robust is it to noise? We only understood it, the previous lemma only tells us about the population case, but we have noisy data. So how will it perform? And second is how strong is the notion of consistency we can get for pi and theta? Because as mentioned in the beginning, in the previous study about population identifiability of graded membership models, we actually, those identifiability only applies to theta. So here we are also estimating pi. And can it also be consistent? So we provide affirmative answers to this. We provide entry-wise estimation error bounds for pi and theta for each entry of pi and theta uniformly in the case where n and j go to infinity. And additionally, under the challenging local dependence scenario. So here we have two types of local dependence. One results from flattening the tensor, right? After flattening the tensor, we necessarily have dependence. And the other dependence arises from the test design. Like in the A and ES example, there are questions about economy. And in the genetics data, we have that adjacent SNPs in chromosome, they are dependent. So we have two types of local dependence, but we want to provide a unified answer to it. So we define so-called blockwise dependent noise in this flattened data. So I think the notation here are not the most important. The idea is that after we flatten the data, let's consider the number of rows, a number of columns in the flattened data matrix to be J dagger. So J dagger is larger than J, and J dagger is equal to the sum of the categories across all the items. Okay, so that's a different notation. But we assume that these J dagger number of columns can be partitioned into L blocks with each block size not exceeding M, such that the noises are independent across different blocks, but there could be arbitrary dependence inside the block. So it's a general assumption that encompasses both the local dependence resulting from flattening and those resulting from test design. So we impose some assumption for general bounded random variables. I would say these conditions are quite mild, and it is satisfied by the usual design of graded memory model. Actually, for the previous Bayesian approaches, for estimation, people usually will assume that parameters are generated from some prior, and actually those priors will satisfy our assumption. I will not go into detail, but just directly go to the final guarantee. So it's a simplified version. It says that under some assumptions, as long as the case largest singular value of the true parameter matrices, theta star and pi star, are of this scale. And note that this scale is easy to satisfy because previous Bayesian approaches, when they try to do estimation, they impose some Dirichlet prior for the item parameters and for the pi parameters. And we can prove, use basic random matrix theory, that when this prior is imposed, these conditions are met with high probability. So it's really mild condition. And the guarantee that we get is that the maximum difference between pi I and pi I hat across all the subjects in our sample is actually of this order. So the key thing here is the square root of j dagger in the denominator, because the numerator is much smaller than this. And we consider j dagger go to infinity. Okay, so this is really decaying at an almost optimal statistical rate. When we estimate the pi, it tells us that if you have enough columns in the flattened data matrix, then you have this error go to 0. And note that this is a strong consistency notion. It's a uniform consistency. It's not an average consistency. It's taking the maximum across all the subjects. That means the worst possible error for estimating pi is controlled, well controlled. And for the theta, we have also the maximum control. That is the maximum taken over all the items J, all the categories of the item, and all the extreme latent profiles. We look at this difference between the truth and the estimator. We have this error bound. Still, the numerator is quite small, and we can look at the denominator. Here you can see the M pops up. The M is the maximum block size for the locally dependent blocks. And if you consider M to be fixed number, to be a constant, then you can see this denominator basically is the square root of the minimum of n and j dagger. That means in the high dimensional case where n and j dagger both go to infinity, we still have a very nice guarantee that this error decays at a square root rate. But when m is going large, actually we can still allow a large m. M can even go to infinity because this is finite sample error bound. That means actually m may be very large, but as long as n over m still go to infinity. So this is still a valid consistency result. So this is the first time that entry-wise consistency for general graded memory model established for this regime, n and j dagger going to infinity. In previous Bayesian approaches and likelihood approaches, it is not well understood what kind of estimation guarantee we can provide. So in terms of just very quickly, in order to establish this result, the key thing is to study the perturbation of the singular vectors under noise, right? Because in the population case, we have exact answer and explicit formula. The problem of estimation error results from the noise, the locally dependent noise. And those noise will perturb the singular vectors, right? We don't have the population singular vectors. The population singular vectors has a deterministic relationship with our parameters, but we only have the top k singular vectors from data. So we need to understand the perturbation between the two. We need to control how different the estimated singular vectors U and the true singular vectors U star are. So we establish fine-grained 2 to infinity error bound. So 2 to infinity means maximum row norm. So it's not a spectral norm or Frobenius norm, which is kind of loose. So 2 to infinity norm is like we control each row, the difference between the estimated singular vectors and truth, they're actually controlled. So yeah, here I don't want to explain every term here, but the key idea behind the proof is we perform a leave one block out analysis, which shares a similar spirit to leave one out analysis in this nice monograph for spectral methods for data science. But here, since usually when people perform this singular subspace perturbation theory, they look at independent noise. but we have block dependent noise. So we need to be more refined in our analysis. We need to leave one block out. And we also utilize some sharp matrix concentration developed recently from the random matrix community. Okay, I want to briefly talk about the numerical results. So the message from simulation is that we compare our spectral method with a joint maximum likelihood method, which was previously considered as the most computationally efficient method for graded membership model. So it's of course more efficient than Bayesian MCMC, but you can see this computation time gap becomes drastic when we go to high dimensions. So here n, the maximum here is 5,000, and we take j to be equal to n over 5. Okay, so the joint maximum likelihood method takes enormous time. And in terms of estimation error, light blue is joint maximum likelihood, red is our method. You can see their estimation errors are quite comparable. And I would like to comment that comparable errors are already good things for us because we are likelihood-free method. We are not an iterative algorithm. And we did not use the full information about the likelihood, but we're able to achieve a comparable estimation error. Okay, now let's go back to the motivating data example and talk about some interesting substantive findings here. So we applied our method to the American National Election Studies, the pilot survey for 2022. And this heat map shows a subset of the estimated item parameters with k equal to 3, because previous empirical works suggest that k equal to 3 is a reasonable number of extreme latent profiles. So here, each row corresponds to a question in the survey, and each column corresponds to an extreme latent profile. So we give it this name by interpreting the numbers. This first column is conservative. This is indifferent, politically indifferent, and this is liberal. So you can see, for example, the first question here asks, which political party would do a better job handling taxes? And because this is like a number, right? So these numbers are probabilities corresponding to the response category in the parentheses. Okay, so if we look at the first row, that means for these 3 different extreme latent profiles, their conditional response probability to responding that Democrat is better at handling taxes is respectively 0 probability, 0.01, and 1. Okay, so you can see, oh, this is really a liberal extreme latent profile. This is conservative. And for example, other more apparent answers here. Does Roe v. Wade being overturned make you feel worried? So for this conservative one, we have this large number, and this is 0. And for this politically indifferent, we can see that for a question like, are you registered to vote? That this indifferent latent class has 0.46. It's very low, but the other 2, they are kind of strong, politically engaged, so they have large probability. Okay, so that's the interpretation from this heat map. And we also, because we also have nice understanding of this pi I hat, we know they can be consistently estimated, so we visualize it here as well. K is equal to 3 here, so we can visualize the estimated pi I k hat using this simplex. Is a ternary diagram. And each extreme latent profile is given the name of indifferent, conservative, and liberal. And each point corresponds to one of these 15,000 or so respondents. And the color are defined by the self-reported party information that we did not use in fitting our model. So it's like we held out the party information and just look at the responses to the survey items. But after we plot this pi k, we color code each data point and to try to understand whether our estimated pi k has some relationship to this self-reported party information. So you can see there's indeed such a correspondence. Those conservative, those self-reported Democrats, they are more liberal, but some are kind of indifferent. And those self-reported Republicans, they are more conservative, but some are indifferent. There are some mixed memberships of political opinions in the middle, but there are rarely some mixed memberships across conservative and liberal because they are like extreme. So in this area, we don't observe too many respondents. Okay, so we also applied our method to the International HapMap project to understand population human genetics. And in that literature, there was a very popular and influential MCMC method called structure. It has been cited tens of thousands of times, and it performs MCMC estimation for pi. And here we compare our method, our estimated pi with theirs. So this figure is corresponding to, for example, if we look at this upper level, this is given by structure. The second panel is given by our method. And each vertical slice represents an individual. And the three colors corresponds to the three extreme latent profiles that we have. And the length of each color bar is proportional to our estimated pi I k hat. For both methods, we can do the same visualization. And here, by eyeballing, we can see that our estimated result is quite comparable to theirs. And but note that we take just a fraction of their time. So they take 44 hours, and we take 9 seconds. Okay, and this J is like more than 200K, more than 200,000 SNPs. So here, this interpretation is also consistent with previous biological knowledge. It says that we use K equal to 3, and one is corresponding to CEU, Northern and Western European ancestry. One is YRI, this ancestry. And the previous biological knowledge suggests that actually this ASW, African ancestry, is kind of lies in between, or is an admixture of YRI and CEU. And from this ternary diagram, we can observe this. Yeah. So of course, this ternary diagram is generated by our method, but if you generate the ternary diagram using their method, it will be similar because the estimated pi are similar from this first illustration here.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
In your previous slides with these ternary diagrams, does this provide a way to sort of empirically validate your pure subjects criterion? Like you see that you have a red dot and you have the right color dot in each corner, and you're like, okay, that seems like there is a pure subject.
Yeah. That's a very good point. But actually, I would say there's a bit of a caveat here in that we assumed there exists pure subject to start with, and there's a step in our algorithm that hunts for the pure subjects. So we naturally will have it. But I think some kind of empirical justification is that we observe things that are close.
Didn't use the party.
Yeah. We didn't use it yet, but yeah. So this figure shows that even if we didn't use the party information, we're able to find those pure subjects that are kind of members, pure members of those party. Yeah, and there are points that are quite close to this vertices. So I think it also empirically justifies, it makes sense to assume pure subjects. Yeah, so I think I'm over time, so I will skip the single cell data example. Yeah, and here's a quick summary. So in terms of methodology, we propose a novel SVD-based spectral method to mix membership estimation for high-dimensional polytomous data, and they are potentially locally dependent. And we studied expectation identifiability and proposed transparent conditions like pure subject condition to ensure it. And we also provide statistical guarantees, that is entry-wise or uniform consistency for all the parameters in this locally dependent graded membership model. And a theoretical byproduct that might be useful elsewhere is we provide new entry-wise singular subspace perturbation bounds for asymmetric random matrices with local dependent noise. So the binary response paper is already published this year, and about the polytomous data and locally dependent case with the new singular subspace perturbation theory is still in preparation, but I hope to be able to wrap it up in the following 2 months or so and post it. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
We are over time, but if anyone has time to stick around and ask a couple questions, if that's okay with you, Yuqi.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions.
I have one. Is there a way to impose structure on the noise matrix using known information about local dependence between items in order to improve estimation bounds?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, we thought about it, but we don't have a clear answer yet. The current procedure and the current estimation theory, the theoretical guarantee, actually is derived without assuming we know this structure. So as long as the noise actually follows some locally dependent structure, actually we always have this guarantee, and we don't need to know which items are grouped together. But I think it's very interesting to think about whether some methods can be able to leverage that information. But spectral methods may not be the best vehicle for that thinking, because we are extracting the singular vectors, so we are not writing any likelihood. But maybe for likelihood-based methods, we can better use that information in specifying a likelihood that uses the local block structures.
Yeah, the thing that seems that it would do, or at least it seemed to me that it might do, is reduce your maximum block size in the noise matrix to just what the maximum number of categories in a single item would be.
Oh, sorry, can you say it again?
Like, it would reduce the maximum block size in your noise matrix from, sort of like categories times items to just what the maximum number of categories is within a single item. Do you have that sort of information?
Yeah, I think, in terms of theory, what we do is that in terms of estimation, we don't use that at all, but we need to impose the assumption that the entries in the flattened data matrix can be shuffled so that the noises are only dependent within a block, not across blocks. And this M, this assumption about how large each block could be, actually will be playing an important role in the bound. But in terms of the method, I think it's not, if we know, for example, like you said, the number of items all the items are conditionally independent. And we know for sure that the local dependence is just a consequence of the flattening, then actually we can take this M, in terms of theory, we can take this M equal to the maximum number of categories for an item. And then this bound will be tighter. Yeah, so I think that's the current thing we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and attention. Thank you.